So to take us back to the reality of the situation during the Asuka period and during the later Nara period, as we shall see here, yes, political power did become more and more concentrated at the center in the capital, in the hands of the imperial family. But the imperial family, of course, certainly wanted more power, and so what they did in part was they tried to break the power of the major religious institutions. Great, rich monasteries like Todaiji, the central monastery, the central Buddhist temple of Japan that had branch temples everywhere. Yes, they were useful because they provided recruits for the government and the bureaucracy, but really by the end of the Nara period, they were becoming a little too powerful. They were gaining too much power. Emperors could not really make their voices heard sometimes when powerful monks and abbots wanted to get in their way. So the Japanese court reverted to an old expedient. They moved the capital and just left the monasteries back in Nara. Before the Asuka period, it was actually during the Asuka period even, it was common for Japanese capitals to be moved. Usually when a new emperor came to power, they kind of revived that idea, and at the end of the 8th century, they moved the capital from Nara, which is right here, just a little further north to Kyoto, which is right here. And yes, they left the Buddhist monasteries behind, and they thought they had figured out how to keep control of their own power. This was not to be, because the Heian period, well, it started out as more or less defined by more or less powerful emperors who could usually get their commands carried out. It quickly became clear that during this period, what historians refer to as classical Japan, the Heian period, the court aristocrats, the great families at court, were going to be the ones who were going to be really in charge of the government. And there were several powerful families, top among which were the Fujiwara. They were not alone. There were also families like the Sugawara and the Tachibana, but the Fujiwara basically, certainly by the middle late 10th century, managed to gain a truly almost impregnable position of power within the Japanese government, and gain a level of control over the emperor that was truly astounding. And what they did was they set themselves up as regents. And this was done through an ingenious mechanism perfected by this man, Fujiwara no Michinaga, lived from 966 to 1028. By the way, in Japanese, how do the names work? See Fujiwara no Michinaga. Fujiwara is his family name. No is basically like saying of. It's actually omitted later in Japanese history. And then there is a given name, Michinaga. So the Michinaga, who is from the Fujiwara clan, sounds relatively simple. Of course, when we get later into Japanese history, and especially into samurai history, names change all the time. When you have a great life-changing event, you may change your family name even, or if you want to found a branch family that is separate from the control of a powerful patriarch, you can do that. Your given name, you change all the time. Something noticeable happens in your life. Oh, I retired. Oh, okay, I'm no longer Katsuko Kichi. I'm now Musui. That's coming up in a later reading. You have his memoir. There were also practices of having people have their formal name, Fujiwara no Michinaga. That's his formal name. Then you would have daily use names, which people would use in informal situations, and then you might also have names that only your closest friends can use. These are very hard to figure out sometimes. The sources that you all have, by and large, dispense with that confusion just by settling on the most commonly recognizable name of a Japanese individuals and calling them by that. But please do keep in mind that these people change how they're referred to all the time. Certainly the samurai do. Necessary digression, but back to Fujiwara no Michinaga. This guy who figured out how to control the emperor. How did he do that? He did it through marriage. Fujiwara marriage politics are actually relatively simple. So what you have is, as the clan head, you have a daughter. You always want daughters. Certainly you want sons to carry on the family name, but you really want daughters because what happens is you marry your daughter to the emperor. Marry your daughter to the ruling emperor, the reigning emperor. And step 3, you wait for an heir, so they reproduce, and then along comes a crown prince. Now you want a son. You want your grandson to be the next emperor, so you want him to be a man. By the Heian period, it had become standard practice for men only to inherit the throne. We'll see several more female emperors later during the Edo period. Oops, excuse me. But we are now operating in a political environment where if you produce a crown prince who is your daughter's son, your grandson, you're in a very good place, because what you can do is you can get the reigning emperor to retire young. Emperors during this time had become very dependent on their regents, right? These people like Fujiwara no Michinaga, who are standing over their shoulder and telling them what to do. Plus, in many ways, to be an emperor isn't really that much fun. Custom constrains your actions to a great degree. You perform ceremonies all the time. And you can't really exercise any imperial or independent power very easily. So what you do is you retire young. Japanese emperors during the Heian period retired often in their 20s, in their teens. I mean, these people just can't wait to be out of office. And then you go to a monastery and you become basically what's known as a cloistered emperor. Somebody who is a monk. You shave your head, and you are now free, more or less. You can have charge of your life again. This was very appealing to these emperors, and in many cases, these cloistered emperors, over time, not immediately, not during Fujiwara no Michinaga's lifetime, really, but soon afterwards, began to develop power bases of their own, outside of government, but nevertheless attracting people to them and kind of founding a shadow government in many cases. But when this Fujiwara marriage machine was just starting out, basically these cloistered emperors were out of the way. Then what happens? Your 2-year-old, 1-year-old, I don't know, 6-year-old grandson becomes the next emperor. And who is the infant or child emperor going to look to tell him what to do? None other than dear old grandpa, Fujiwara no Michinaga, and people like him. This process basically, step 7, repeat as needed, and this process just continued. Have a daughter, get her to marry the emperor, wait for an heir. The emperor retires, the crown prince becomes elevated to emperor, and you, as the head of the family, control the emperor. Soon, as I said, this will lead to conflict between reigning and cloistered emperors, but we're not quite there yet. During the end of the Heian period, we'll see how the samurai exploit that. But it does lead to aristocratic infighting. The Fujiwara are constantly scheming to keep their supremacy. The Tachibana, Sugawara, all those other people try to replace them. And this kind of competition gets played out at court, and the losers of these battles are almost never killed. They're usually exiled. So if a Fujiwara regent manages to push you out of power, you might be given a important sounding assignment far away from the capital of Kyoto, where you really didn't want to be. Everybody wanted to be in Kyoto during this time. But you wouldn't usually be killed. And so the aristocrats in general, and the Fujiwara in particular, during the Heian period, became the centers of political power in Japan, not the emperor. The emperor became a figurehead. And this coincided with the rise of what we call shoen. Shoen are estates, public estates, that were they were a development, they were a result of this implementation of this Chinese-inspired Ritsuryo code. These are private estates, but it took a while to get to the situation where you can legally have private estates in classical Japan. You had the model, in the Chinese model, the idea that all land belonged to the emperor. This was public land, and it is to be worked, to be developed, but the people who oversee it and also the people who work it have to return the land to the government after 3 generations and wait for the government to redistribute it based on the needs of the people involved. Now, this seems very logical, this seems very well thought out, but really what it did is it was a flop. It did not produce sufficient tax revenue, in part because nobody cared enough about the land to try and improve it. After all, what's the use? After 3 generations, you'll be gone, and all of these improvement irrigation projects, all of just trying to get sources of mechanical energy, fertilizers for new intensive ways of fertilizing crops. What's the point? The person who's going to inherit this after you is going to reap the benefits of it, so why try? This is a very bad way of encouraging productivity, or rather a good way of discouraging it. And so the government, and by the way, when the government, in regions closer to the capital, this worked better, of course, as you went out into the countryside, increasingly people ignored imperial orders. People were essentially squatting on land and making much of it private anyway. So the government bowed to reality. In 734, the government allowed private ownership of land. Now, great aristocrats could own land. The imperial family certainly kept a great deal of land. Land was no longer redistributed. And this certainly was to the liking of the aristocrats. It's in part what allowed them to become ever more powerful, to the point where they could take over political leadership of Japan. In addition to this, 3 kinds of land were exempt from taxes. Imperial land and land of the great aristocrats, land of religious institutions, and 3, newly cultivated land. And increasingly the government, the imperial government, gave away another piece of its land, and another piece of its land, and another piece of its land to elites, to aristocrats, for favors. This is kind of how they made the government work for a while, by decreasing their own economic base in favor of all of these aristocrats, with the understanding that the aristocrats would help the imperial family, and for a short time that did seem to work. and also the land belonging to religious institutions. This is delightful. A lot of people who were small landowners, including many more wealthy peasants, knowing that the religious institutions were tax exempt, basically gave away part of their land, or sometimes all of their land, to local temples, or even better, local temples with branches in Nara or in the new capital of Kyoto, in exchange for an understanding that they would get to keep working that land, but they would pay these institutions, these religious institutions, taxes that were lower than what the government was asking. So kind of everybody won but the government. And from these pieces of privately owned land, you very quickly get the conglomeration. Well, that's a terrible way to put it. You get the joining together, also not, doesn't roll off the tongue, but anyway, you get the putting together of all these strips and pieces of land into basically grand estates called shoen in Japanese. That were controlled either by the imperial family or more and more by aristocrats and also by big religious institutions. And a lot of these shoen were on the frontier of Japan because, remember, newly cultivated land was free from taxation. So you could go out and conquer some land if you were powerful, and we shall see how the samurai played into that dynamic, and then you got to keep it, and you built an estate on there, this shoen, and then you'd be exempt from taxation. Well, good deal. Many aristocrats got into this market, and so you get the growth of these increasingly centralized, increasingly coherent estates, but with the revenues from these estates, most aristocrats, and basically anybody who could, went to Kyoto. They did not live on these estates. Life was not good there. Japan really only had one real city at this point, and that was Kyoto, the capital, also called Heian-kyo, the Heian capital. It has both names, which is why this era is called the Heian era. So you get these aristocrats going there, enjoying the good life and trying to obtain court appointments in the bureaucracy, vying with each other for political influence. And while they're there, they're getting the proceeds of their estates forwarded to them from the countryside, but they don't live there. They're absentee landlords. So who's in control of the shoen?